Most people, they think inflation is something you see on a price chart. They watch a number go up or down and assume that tells the whole story. But in every financial system I've ever observed, the real pressure builds long before the price ever reacts. It builds quietly inside incentives, inside plumbing, inside rules most people never read. By the time inflation shows up, say, on a screen, the decision was already made months or years earlier. And the same thing is happening right now inside one of the most misunderstood crypto networks on the planet. Not through hype, not through speculation, but through governance and its mechanics, infrastructure costs, and how demand actually gets created. Because there's a moment in every system's life where growth stops being the goal and sustainability takes over. And that moment, it's uncomfortable, yes, because it forces trade-offs. You can no longer reward everyone forever. You can no longer overpay for unused capacity. You can no longer pretend that incentives don't matter. And when that moment arrives, the systems that survive are the ones that adjust quietly, early, and deliberately. And that's a lens we're using today. We're not looking at price, we're not looking at narratives, structure. What you're about to hear is not a pitch. It's not a forecast. It's an explanation of how a complex digital economy is trying to slow itself down on purpose without breaking trust, without killing participation, and without losing the very people who helped build it. And understanding this process of Mission 70 may completely change how you think about inflation, governance, and long-term value in crypto as a whole. Because the internet computer isn't trying to grow faster anymore. It's trying to grow correctly. And that 18-page document behind Mission 70 and the discussion outlines something that's very, very important. Because at first glance, the name sounds like a marketing gimmick, but when you actually read the 18-page report in detail, it becomes crystal clear. This is not about hype at all. It's about reducing inflation by changing how tokens are created, how they're rewarded, and how a real demand is supposed to emerge. The goal is simple to state and very hard to execute. Reduce token inflation by at least 70% in a short-term timeframe without destroying incentives, without losing infrastructure, and without breaking governance participation. Anyone who has spent time in traditional finance like myself knows how rare it is for a system to even attempt something like this voluntarily. Because I can tell you from my time observing traditional financial markets, I learned that most systems don't fix inflation at all. They just mask it. They delay it, or they wait until a crisis forces their hand. The most dangerous period is not when inflation is high. It's when inflation is quietly embedded in rules no one questions anymore. And that's why this matters. And it matters a lot because what's being proposed here with Mission 70 here isn't reactive, it's being proactive. And at a high level, the internet computer has three moving parts that determine inflation. First, new tokens are created as rewards for people who participate in governance. Second, new tokens are created to pay the physical infrastructure that runs the network. And third, tokens are destroyed when the network is actually used. Minting on one side, burning on the other. The balance between the two is the entire economic engine. Early on, inflation was intentionally high on purpose. That's normal. New systems overpay to attract participation. They reward patience. They reward risk, obviously. They reward people willing to lock capital when nothing is proven yet. But that phase cannot last forever. And I could tell you from my time in TradFi, this is a transition from venture spending to cash flow discipline. And in crypto, it's a transition from bootstrapping to sustainability. And what's different here is how openly this transition is being discussed. Because The proposal for Mission 70 doesn't deny that inflation exists. It explains exactly where it comes from. It explains why those numbers made sense in the early years, of course, and then it explains why they no longer do. There's one thing from my experience I can tell you, what taught me deeply is that incentives, they don't fail loudly. They fail quietly. You don't notice them until behavior actually changes, until participation drops, until capital slowly stops caring. And this is why the focus here is not on excitement, okay, but on the actual alignment. How do you keep people voting, okay, without overpaying them? How do you say keep infrastructure online without rewarding unused capacity? How do you create real demand instead of artificial scarcity? Those are the real questions that Mission 70 is asking. And this is where most crypto discussions fall apart. They jump straight to conclusions. They talk about outcomes instead of the actual mechanics. They focus on the charts or the price instead of the actual systems. So here's a promise for the rest of this breakdown. And by the end, you'll understand exactly how inflation is created inside this network, and you will understand why long lockups once made sense and why they may no longer be necessary. And you will understand why unused infrastructure is one of the most expensive hidden costs in any system. And you will understand why demand doesn't come from narratives. It comes from actual usefulness. No hype, no urgency, just structure. And everything from here forward built on that foundation with Mission 70. To understand why these changes even exist, you first have to understand how inflation actually enters the system. Not in theory, not in headlines, but in actual mechanics. Because the internet computer mints new tokens in two very specific ways. Okay? One is governance, the other is infrastructure. Governance minting happens when people lock up tokens and participate in decision making. Okay? And infrastructure minting happens when no providers run the machines that keep the network running and alive. On the other side of the equation, tokens are destroyed when they're converted into cycles and spent on real computation storage and bandwidth. This isn't abstract, it's accounting. If more tokens are minted than burned, what happens? Supply grows. If more tokens are burned than minted, supply shrinks. Economics 101. There is no narrative override for that reality. Early in ICP's network's life, inflation was intentionally high on purpose. That wasn't a mistake, okay? It was an actual design choice. And I could tell you, from my time in TradFi, like obviously dealing with financial systems, this is similar to how young infrastructure projects behave. It's normal. Railroads, telecom networks, data centers, they all start by overpaying to get actually built. The return isn't efficiency. The return is existence. And in the early years, governance rewards were generous. They were very generous because the lockups were long and the risks were real. No providers were paid very well because hardware had to be purchased, deployed, and maintained across many regions around the world with no guarantee of actual future demand. High inflation wasn't a flaw. It was the fuel to get the world computer to where it is today. But every fuel eventually runs out of usefulness. And the problem begins when early stage incentives remain in place after the system has matured. And at that point, inflation stops being a tool and starts being a burden and a drag. And this is where the data becomes uncomfortable for most. Even as real usage has grown, okay, with the cycle burn rate increasing year after year, the system is still minting tokens at a pace that reflects its earliest days. Because when we look at our governance rewards are still calibrated for 8-year lockups. Infrastructure rewards are still paying for machines that often aren't even assigned to active workloads. Now, that mismatch matters. I can tell you in traditional finance, this is a moment when a company realizes it is still paying a startup salaries while trying to operate like a mature firm. It's just not sustainable. Costs don't adjust automatically. They have to be confronted head on. And one of the clearest examples is governance staking. Because to vote, participants lock tokens into structures called neurons. in ICP. Those neurons earn rewards based on three things: how much you stake, how long obviously the lockup is, and how long the neuron has existed without its dissolvement. The longest lockup historically, 8 years, okay, receives the highest rewards at the moment. That made sense when the network needed unwavering commitment, but it also created a side effect. Inflation became concentrated around long-term stakers, regardless, okay, of whether the network still needed that level of compensation, of course. And another issue is accessibility. A 6 month, say, minimum lockup just to vote creates friction also. New participants, okay, often hesitate to commit capital for that long, especially when the final months of a lockup earn no rewards at all. It becomes useless. The system ends up favoring incumbents, not necessarily contributors. And that's the issue. And that I saw something similar years ago, watching pension structures struggle to modernize. They were built for a different labor market. The rules were logical when written, but over time, they just became rigid, became expensive, and they were disconnected from the reality of it all. And that's a lens being applied here with internet computer, because the proposal doesn't eliminate long-term staking. It reshapes it, okay? Shorter lockups become actually possible, but they're rewarded modestly. Longer commitments are still encouraged, but without forcing participants into nearly decade-long illiquidity. So the idea is to preserve alignment without paying for more than the system actually needs, because this isn't about punishing early supporters or long-term supporters. In fact, there's explicit recognition of long-term participants who committed when uncertainty was the highest, but honoring history doesn't mean freezing incentives. No. On the infrastructure side, the picture is even clearer. We're talking roughly half of all nodes on the network are not actively assigned to subnets. It's a big issue here. They exist, they're paid, but they're idle. And I can tell you, in TradFi, paying for unused capacity at scale is a warning sign. It's just not sustainable in the long run. It's tolerated early on, okay, but it becomes an unacceptable factor later. Because I can tell you from my experience, what matters isn't whether capacity exists, okay? It's whether it's aligned with the actual demand. Because overcapacity quietly drains resources without improving the actual outcomes. The proposal of Mission 7 acknowledges this directly. It's important. Legacy nodes, especially older hardware that has long since been paid off, are generating rewards far above their ongoing operating costs. That may have been fair during, the bootstrapping phases in its early days, but it's harder to justify in a mature network that ICP is today. And this sets up the central tension of Mission 70. How do you reduce inflation without weakening security? How do you actually pay less without losing providers? How do you slow issuance without actually discouraging participation? Those questions don't have simple answers, okay? But they do have structured ones, and to understand the first major shift, governance, rewards, you need to understand how voting and power and reward pools actually work today. And that's where we go next. Because governance, sounds abstract until you look at how it's paid for. So once you do, the incentives become very real. Every day, a fixed pool of newly minted tokens is set aside to reward governance participation. And that pool isn't random, It's calculated as a percentage of total supply. And that percentage slowly declines over the network's early years before flattening out. So in plain terms, the bigger the supply, obviously the bigger the reward pool. And once the decline period ends, that pool grows automatically with supply unless something actively stops it. That detail matters more than it seems, because I can tell you from my experience in TradFi, this is similar to a compensation formula tied to a revenue instead of profit, As long as, say, the revenue grows, payouts grow, even if efficiency doesn't. And over time, that structure almost gets revised, because governance rewards on the Internet Computer Protocol, they're distributed based on voting power. Voting power isn't just how many tokens someone locks. It's multiplied by actually how long those tokens are locked for and how long the neuron has actually existed. So if two people stake the same amount, the one who locks longer and stays longer earns more influence and obviously more rewards. Again, that made sense in the early days, but long term, commitment reduced volatility and stabilized governance. There's a second order of effect in this, which is important because when most voting power classes at the maximum lockup, the reward system stops differentiating between different kinds of commitment. And that's the issue. It becomes top heavy. And from what I've seen from my experience in TradFi systems, this often leads to complacency because participation becomes passive. Voting becomes automatic. Rewards flow, but engagement doesn't necessarily deepen. So the proposal from Mission 70 addresses this by changing three core elements at once. First, the maximum lockup period is reduced dramatically. Instead of asking people to commit for almost a decade, 8 years, the system asks for years, not eras. That alone lowers the compensation required to keep people engaged. Second, the minimum lock-up period is shortened. This matters more than it sounds because it lowers the barrier to entry and allows newer participants to engage without feeling trapped. Short-term participation becomes possible, but not overly lucrative. And third, and most important, the relationship between the actual lockup length and rewards is reshaped. Instead of a straight line where each extra unit of time earns the same incremental reward, the curve, it actually becomes convex because early time commitments earn little. Longer commitments earn disproportionately more, but it's subtle but powerful because in real world term use, I can tell you, it's a difference between paying someone, say, per hour versus paying them more only once they've stayed long enough to matter. It discourages shallow participation while actually preserving incentives for real alignment. And I can tell you from my experience watching compensation systems in TradFi, evolving convex rewards tend to produce healthier behavior because they don't eliminate short-term actors, okay? They just stop overpaying them. There's also an important cultural element here too in all this because the long-term supporters, the believers who are committed at the maximum lockup, when the network was unproven, are explicitly acknowledged, they're acknowledged too. They aren't lumped in with new participants. They're not. Their historical alignment is recognized, okay, with a temporary reward boost that fades over time. And that kind of recognition matters, because in every mature system, honoring early risk takers helps maintain trust during transitions. But even with all these changes, okay, with Mission 70, there's a deeper issue because once the early bootstrapping phase ends, which it has, governance rules stop declining, they flatten. If nothing changes, that means governance minting grows automatically. If Mission 70 doesn't get approved, supply grows, it becomes open-ended. Because I can tell you from my experience, open-ended obligations eventually force hard resets. Caps get introduced, budgets get enforced. And that's exactly what's being proposed here. Because a hard ceiling on governance rewards after the initial growth phase, not a freeze, a limit, the daily reward pool would be capped at a fixed level, tied to the network's size at maturity. Say, for instance, if supply grows, rewards don't automatically grow with it. And this is one of the most important changes in the entire Mission 70 proposal because it shifts governance rewards from an inflation amplifier into a predictable cost. It makes future inflation easier to reason about, and it signals a shift from expansion to stewardship. Because in systems I've observed, this is the moment when a network stops actually asking, how do we grow faster? And starts asking, how do we endure? But governance rewards are only half the story. Even if the issuance slows, okay, what happens when people convert those rewards into actual tokens? That matters just as much. That's where maturity disbursement comes into all this. And that mechanic has its own hidden effects. And that's next. Most people think inflation happens when tokens are minted, okay? That's only half the story, okay? Because the other half is when those tokens are actually become liquid on the internet computer, governance rewards don't just immediately increase this underlying circulation supply. They first accrue as maturity inside neurons. And maturity is a claim on the actual future tokens, not tokens themselves. And that distinction is critical here because as long as rewards stay as maturity, they don't hit the market. They don't affect underlying liquidity. They don't pressure price. They exist off balance sheet in a sense. And inflation becomes real only when maturity is converted into ICP, obviously through disbursement. And historically, this type of conversion has been frictionless. But once maturity was available, it could be spawned into liquid tokens almost immediately. And that made maturity functionality equivalent to, say, delay cash, not long-term alignment. But from a systems perspective, this could say it could be dangerous because I could tell you from experience as trapper, this would be like deferred compensation that vests instantly with no conditions. So the deferral looks good on paper, but the behavior doesn't actually change. So the proposal here, Mission 70, tightens this channel. Instead of instant conversion, maturity disbursement becomes time-bound and probabilistic. Participants choose a disbursement period, say 1, 3 years or 6 months, and maturity converts gradually over that window. This does two things at once. First, it smooths supply. Instead of reward emissions hitting the market in bursts, they flow out steadily. Second, it changes incentives. So if you want liquidity faster, you accept the lower conversion. If you're willing to wait, you're rewarded with a higher probability of full disbursement. And this mirrors real world capital structures more closely than people actually realize. Because in many pension systems, I can tell you, and long-term incentive plans, early access is penalized. Not prohibited, okay? Penalized. The choice exists, but it's costly. And what's important here is that systems that doesn't force alignment, it prices it. And there's another subtle benefit here too, because when maturity conversion actually takes time, governance participants also naturally think longer term. Voting behavior becomes less transactional. You're less likely to extract the value quickly if that extraction itself carries friction. Because I can tell you from my experience, this kind of design tends to improve decision quality. People who are locked into outcomes care more about the actual underlying outcome. But maturity isn't only about governance rewards. No providers also receive rewards that ultimately become liquid supply. And here's the issue, even more concrete, because no rewards are paid daily. They're predictable. And for many operators, they significantly exceed ongoing costs, especially for older hardware users. And this creates a one-way flow, mint, pay, sell. And the proposal doesn't pretend otherwise. Instead, what Mission 70 does is to introduce two structural changes. First, no rewards are recalibrated based on the actual usage. This is key. Idle nodes earn less, active nodes earn more. This alignment, payment with demand instead of the actual existence. Second, the total no rewards budget is reduced over time, not abruptly, but gradually. And this mirrors how infrastructure contracts work in the real world. Early contracts are rich to attract, of course. It's rich to attract supplies, but later contracts normalize as the market matures. And the combined effect is important because governance rewards become capped and slower to liquidate. No rewards, what do? They become more efficient and demand driven. So both channels reduce net issuance without cutting security or underlying participation. But here's the key insight most people miss with this Mission 70. None of these changes matter if the cycle of burn doesn't continue to grow. Burn is the only true counterweight to issuance. So if real usage stalls, okay, inflation control becomes an accounting exercise. So if real usage grows, these actual changes, they actually become multiplicative And this is why Mission 70 isn't just about reducing rewards. It's about timing that transition from subsidized growth to sustainable economics. And in my experience, this transition is where most systems fail. This is timed perfectly. They either cut too hard and lose contributors, or they cut too late and drown in inefficiency. And what's been attempted here is something rarer, a controlled glide path. But that glide path only works if the network is actually ready for it. So the real question isn't whether these changes are rational, it's whether the internet computer protocol has reached the point where it can afford them. And answering that requires looking at the usage, the cycle burn, and demand trends, not ideology. And that's where we go next. Because everything so far assumes one thing, that the network is strong enough to stand on its own. So you can redesign incentives perfectly. You can cap rewards, which Mission 70 does, slow disbursements, and trim excess capacity, which Mission 70 does. But if real demand isn't there, none of this holds. And this is where cycle burn becomes the deciding variable. Cycles are the internet computer's unit of real economic activity. They are consumed when applications compute, store data, and serve users. Unlike governance rewards or no payments, cycles are not narrative. They are spent only when something actually runs. Burn is demand made visible. Because I could tell you, over the past few years, cycle consumption has trended steadily upwards. Not explosively, has had explosive periods, but persistently. That matters more than hype-driven spikes. Because I could tell you, from traditional infrastructure businesses, this is the difference between, say, a viral launch and recurring revenue, okay? The latter is what allows costs to be normalized. But what's important is where burn is coming from. It's no longer dominated by experiments or short-lived demos. A growing share comes from persistent services, back-end APIs, storage-heavy applications, decentralized front-end, and long-running workloads. And these are the kinds of workloads that justify stable infrastructure. Because I got to tell you, from experience, one usually shifts from, say, exploratory to operational, cost discipline becomes impossible. You're no longer guessing at demand, you're measuring it. And this is why Mission 70 ties inflation reduction to usage maturity, not price or sentiment. It doesn't care about price, because if cycle burn were flat or falling, these proposals would be reckless. They would risk underpaying providers and hollowing out security. But with the burn rising, excess issuance becomes visible. You can see the gap between what the network needs to pay for and what it's currently issuing. That gap is what Mission 70 targets. Because another key signal here in all this is overcapacity. As mentioned earlier, okay, roughly half of the nodes are idle, and that's a lot. It's a big percentage. That's not a failure. It's a sign of cautious. It's cautious overbuilding, because every serious infrastructure provider overbuilds at the start. It's normal. The mistake is not corrected later. Because in cloud markets, this is where pricing changes, because reserved instance replace on-demand premiums, okay? Efficiency improves without actually sacrificing availability. That's exactly the analogy here. Idle capacity stops being subsidized at the same rate as productive capacity. The network doesn't lose redundancy, it loses waste. Critically, security assumptions remain intact in all this. The geographic distribution of nodes doesn't change. The diversity of operators doesn't collapse. What changes is the return profile. Low effort, low utilization. Participation becomes less attractive. High quality, well-run participation remains viable. So this filters contributors without excluding them. Now let's zoom out. Mission 70 is not a single lever. It's a coordinated adjustment across issuance, liquidity, and cost alignment. Token governance, minting slows and caps. Liquidity release becomes smoother and incentive aligned. And the underlying infrastructure rewards track actual real usage. Excess capacity stops being overpaid, and burn continues to rise as real workloads grow with Caffeine AI. And together, these shifts aim at one outcome, bringing net issuance closer to zero without financial shock. And that's the holy grail of any monetary system. Because I can tell you, from my experience in TradFi, very few systems achieve this gradually and gracefully. Most rely on crises to force discipline. But what's unusual here is that the adjustment is happening before a crisis. That doesn't make it painless, okay? But some participants will earn less, yes. But some strategies will stop working. But some systems that survive are the ones that adapt before the adaptation becomes mandatory and will be forced for survival. So when people ask whether Mission 70 is bullish or bearish, they're asking the wrong question. The real question is, does this mark the moment the internet computer stops being subsidized infrastructure and starts behaving like a self-sustaining one? And if the answer is yes, then volatility is the price of maturity, and maturity is the price of survival. And there's one final layer that hasn't been addressed yet, and it's the one that most people instinctively focus on first, even though it should come last: price. Price is not a lever in this system. It's a consequence. In immature networks, okay, price leads behavior. In mature networks, behavior leads price. Mission 7 is explicitly designed around the second model. So if you look at a failed monetary transition, so in crypto, traditional finance, they almost always share one fatal flaw. They try to target price stability instead of actually earning it. Controls are imposed. What happens? Emissions are slashed overnight. Liquidity disappears. Confidence breaks. And here, none of that is happening at all. Instead, the system is tightening the pipes, not closing the valves. And inflation doesn't drop to zero. It narrows. Liquidity doesn't vanish. It's smoothed out. Rewards don't disappear. They actually become conditional. And this distinction is subtle, but very decisive. Because I can tell you, this is the difference between, say, for example, a company announcing layoffs versus quietly ending overhiring, freezing excess budget, and letting, say, efficiency emerge organically. Because one shocks confidence, the other restores it. And this leads to a counterintuitive insight. Because in the short term, Mission 70 may increase volatility, sure, because some participants were implicitly arbitraging inefficiency. Idle nodes, high liquidity, high governance rewards, strategies that assumed issuance would always outrun burn. Those strategies unwind first, okay, they create noise, it's normal, but once those dynamics flush out, what remains is a cleaner signal. And at that price point, price starts responding to the actual fundamentals instead of flows, because we're talking usage, and issuance, security, predictable costs. That's the environment long-term capital actually needs. So one more thing that matters here is credibility in all this, because Mission 70 is not being introduced during panic. There is no emergency though, there is no existential failure forcing action on the network. That alone sends a signal. It says the system believes it has time. And systems with time can choose structure over reaction. Because I can tell you from my experience, this is where long-term duration capital starts paying attention. Not because returns are guaranteed, but because rules stop changing emotionally. And this is also why the proposal is so detailed. Loose systems use vague language. Serious systems specify mechanics. Every curve adjustment, every cap, every delay is an attempt to remove ambiguity from future outcomes. And that's what's going to attract institutional capital, not to control them, to bound them, because that's how trust is built at scale. So if you zoom all the way out, Mission 70 is not really about inflation. It's about transitioning from subsidized trust to earned trust. Because early on, the network paid people to believe. Now it's asking the network to justify belief through the actual use. That's a hard transition, I get it. But it's the only one that actually lasts long term and is going to attract major capital. Most networks never reach this phase. They either collapse under their own weight. Incentives, freeze under governance, reaching the point where the world computer is. This conversation is even possible. It's already a signal of maturing the network. What happens next won't be clean, but it will be real. And real systems, unlike speculative ones, don't need constant narrative support. They just need to work. And it works. Every structural change creates winners and losers. It's part of the game. The mistake is pretending otherwise, okay? Because Mission 70 doesn't redistribute value randomly, okay? It redistributes value along lines of behavior. And if you understand those lines, the proposal becomes crystal clear. The winners are long-term governance participants who are genuinely aligned, participants who stake with the actual intent to remain engaged, not just the farm rewards, benefit from the reshaped curve. They still earn, they still influence decisions, but now their returns are less diluted by shallow participation. Convex rewards favor staying, not arriving early and exiting fast. So in practical terms, serious governors gain relative power as casual capital loses efficiency. And this is how every mature governance system evolves. Also, builders and applications that drive real cycle burn, anything that increases sustained usage benefits. Also, as issuance slows and burn rises, applications that generate continuous demand become the economic center of gravity. And this matters because it flips the narrative in all this. It flips it hard. So not which token has said the loudest story. No. But which network actually gets used every day. Builders become economic actors, not marketing props. That's rare in crypto. And obviously efficient, well-run node providers, operators with modern hardware, good uptime, and active subnet participation remain profitable. Yes, they may earn less per node, but they operate at scale, efficiency, and relevance. And the margins are still attractive. And over time, this creates professionalization in infrastructure markets. This is when hobbyists fade and the operators emerge. And that's not failure, it's maturation. And also, you got to look at the long-term horizon capital, because funds and participants who care about the ICP network, we're talking predictable issuance, bounded inflation, transparent cost structures, finally get a system they can model. Volatility doesn't disappear, but it becomes explainable. And that's the difference between speculation and allocation. The losers, strategies built on maximum lockups, okay? Minimal engagement. They're the losers from this. Fast maturity extraction lose their edge. They can still participate. They just can't extract disproportionately anymore. And that's a waste for the ecosystem, because this is intentional. If your node exists but doesn't contribute to active workloads, your economics deteriorate. Not overnight, but inevitably. Because I can tell you, from my experience, this is where resistance comes from, not because the system is unfair, no, but because inefficiency was profitable. Mission 70 removes that subsidy. It's key here. Anything that relied on predictable sell pressure as liquidity source will face adjustment. Talk lower, smoother issuance changes, good market structure. Some strategies stop working. That's not anti-market, of course. That's market evolution. Retail doesn't immediately win or lose, but over time, I can tell you, retail benefits from many different things. We're talking reduced dilution, clearer incentives for retail, less reflexive sell pressure. People always complain the price gets dumped all the time. The benefit is delayed, yes, which is why it's rarely celebrated. But Mission 70 doesn't punish risk. It punishes misalignment. It rewards the actual usage over existence. Investment over convenience. This is key here. Efficiency over entitlement. Every system that survives over the long term eventually makes this shift, and internet computer is no different. The uncomfortable part is that it exposes who was contributing and who was just a leech collecting. And that's why debates around proposals like this are never purely technical. They're economic. And obviously economic debates are always emotional when incentives change, because there's people that are going to lose out. And the final piece to understand is what is being said out loud. Yeah, the second order effects here, those matter more than the actual direct changes, because to understand what Mission 70 really does, You have to stop comparing ICP to where other layer ones are and start comparing it to where they are actually going to be forced to go. Because most layer ones in crypto are still in their subsidy phase, okay? High emissions, loose incentives, growth finance dilution. That phase always feels good, okay? Until it doesn't. No one's talking about this. Every layer one eventually faces the same more ICP is facing today because emissions can't stay high forever, okay? They just can't. It's not sustainable. Validators demand predictable returns, Users demand low, stable costs. It's capital demands clarity on long-term supply. So the difference is timing. Most layer ones will be forced into austerity during stress. That's just a matter of time. Price drawdowns, you name it. Validator exits, security scares, you can name it. Like we could be talking emergency governance votes. ICP is attempting this transition preemptively. That alone puts it in a different category. Ethereum, Solana, Cosmos, and their derivatives all share a structural tension. Security scales with token price. So, for instance, lower price, lower staking value. Weaker security, higher risk. To compensate, many chains, you know what they do in the layer ones? They keep emissions high far longer than planned. That's not a design flaw, it's a dependency. ICO breaks this loop because no providers are paid for actually compute capacity, not for staking a volatile asset whose value determines security. Security is operational, not speculative on the war computer. So by reducing issuance, okay, but while maintaining infrastructure security, ICP demonstrates here something that most chains just can't. Security that doesn't require perpetual dilution. And that's quite but a profound difference. We're talking modular stacks, promise cheap execution, but only by externalizing costs. And data availability layers subsidize these. Sequences capture value. Users pay indirectly through inflation elsewhere. It works until subsidies shrink. 1976, the ICP is preparing for a world where costs must be covered by usage. Subsidies taper. Value capture has to be honest, and that positions ICP closer to traditional infrastructure economics than actual experimental tokenomics. For enterprises and long-lived applications, that matters more than TPS headlines. Most layer one governance systems suffer from one of two problems in all this. Too centralized to matter. It's simple. Too diffuse to act. By reshaping governance incentives, ICP is narrowing participation to those willing to stay engaged without actually overpaying them. And that produces decisive governance without the actual panic. Because in comparative terms, okay, that's rare. As look, Ethereum governance avoids hard decisions by design because many smaller chains overreact because they must. ICP is carving out a middle path here, structured, mechanical, and bounded. And here's the key. Reframing. Most layer ones promise a future of low issuance, okay? ICP is designed for it. Most layer ones, they rely on price appreciation to justify security. ICP relies on usage. Most layer ones defer hard choices. ICP is front loading them. That doesn't guarantee success, but it dramatically reduces the probability of catastrophic failure. From an allocator's perspective, that changes the risk profile completely for the world computer if mission 70 gets accepted. Less reflects the upside. We're talking less essential downside. That's not how speculative capital thinks. That's how infrastructure capital thinks. Mission 70 quietly repositioned ICP from high potential crypto network to actual early stage decentralized infrastructure platform. Those two labels attract completely different audiences. And the first chases narratives, the second builds actual systems. ICP isn't trying to win the next cycle's marketing war. Hell no. It's trying to still be here in the next cycle and the next cycle after that. Because the final piece and the hardest model is a long-term monetary endgame. What ICP looks like after Mission 70 succeeds, now that's where everything converges. Once Mission 70 is fully absorbed, okay? A system enters a phase most crypto networks only talk about but never will reach. Stability without stagnation. This is the end game. Few designs survive long enough to confront. Because in the long run, ICP is not aiming for zero issuance, okay? That's a common misunderstanding in all this. Zero issuance systems are brittle. They depend on fees alone and tend to underinvest in security during downturns. Instead, the target is bounded, predictable issuance that is structurally offset by burn. Not perfect, not every day, but over cycles. Issuance becomes a maintenance cost, not a growth engine, and that's a critical shift because in the end state, cycle burn, not governance votes, becomes the primary regulator of supply. More usage, more burn, lower net issuance. Less usage, less burn, higher net issuance within bounds. And this creates a natural stabilizer because in traditional terms, it's closer to a utility model than a monetary experiment. You don't argue endlessly about inflation in a power grid. You price electricity, measure demand, and balance capacity. Simple. And that's the direction ICP is moving. Governance, it doesn't disappear at all. It narrows. Instead of constantly tuning incentives, governance focuses on many important things, protocol upgrades, we're talking security assumptions, focusing on long-term parameter bounds, not reactive monetary policy. And that's when governance stops being politicized. Because in systems I've seen mature, this is the point where governance becomes boring and boring is good. In the end game, no provider stop being rewarded farmers and start resembling regulated infrastructure operators. Returns compress, reliability increases, risk shifts from token price to operational excellence. And this is an uncomfortable truth for early participants, but it's what unlocks scale. No serious institution is built on infrastructure. Security depends on perpetual token inflation. Mission 70 is laying that groundwork for that transition because by the end, ICP mode is no longer a technical novelty. It's economic coherence. Costs, they are paid by usage. That's massive. Security is maintained without dilution spirals. Governance is actually aligned, but not extractive. It's just not bottom feeding. Supply dynamics are they're legible years out. Very few networks will ever reach this configuration, not because it's hard to design, but because it's hard to arrive at without breaking along the way. So if Mission 70 succeeds and gets approved, ICP becomes less exciting to talk about, okay? And far more important to use. It stops behaving like a speculative asset and starts behaving like a digital infrastructure. That transition always alienates part of the audience. Speculators leave, builders stay, institutions begin to notice and start investing. And this is not a victory lap. No, it's a handoff from a system fueled by belief to a system justified by function. Because early on, ICP paid for trust. Mission 7 is about earning it. And the monetary endgame isn't about price. It's about durability. Networks that last don't promise outsized returns forever. It's just not sustainable. They promise they won't disappear. If ICP reaches this end state, the question won't be, how high can it go? No. The question will be, how did we ever build without it? And that's the quiet ambition underneath everything you've just listened to. Because no transition like this is risk-free. If it were, it would have happened already. But Mission 70 is structurally sound, but structure does not eliminate uncertainty. It just makes the uncertainty visible. And that is the part most analysis avoid because it doesn't fit clean narratives. And everything in the end game assumes one thing continues. Cycle burn grows. If usage plateaus while issuance tightens, the system enters a squeeze. Providers will feel underpaid. Builders will feel constrained also in that process. Governance faces pressure to reverse course. I could tell you from traditional infrastructure experience. This is where pricing power matters. If ICP cannot price cycles competitively while still covering costs, the economic loop weakens. This is not theoretical. It's the primary execution risk. Reducing rewards gradually assumes rational, patient operators. Some won't be. Legacy node providers who built economics around or reward curves may exit faster than expected. That could happen. If the cluster exits geographically or operationally, redundancy assumptions could be tested, not catastrophically, but uncomfortably. As in mature systems, this is managed through contracts. Here it's managed through incentives. That's why the incentives are going to be in play. It's just, okay, the margin for error is real. Ironically, reducing governance rewards can increase concentration if participation drops too far. Small participants, for example, disengage, okay? And large holders remain active. Then voting power consolidates. This isn't malicious, it's mechanical. The design, it relies on convex rewards and lower lockups to keep participation broad enough. And if that balance fails, governance legitimacy erodes quietly. And that's harder to fix than inflation. Markets are reflexive too in nature. Short-term traders may interrupt lower issuance as a bearish signal. Others may expect immediate price effects that don't arrive. So, if expectations misalign with reality, sentiment can lack fundamentals for long periods. In infrastructure transitions such as this is normal, but it tests conviction. Many historically successful systems look dead right before becoming indispensable. If other layer ones continue subsidizing growth longer, ICP may look comparatively tight or boring for a while. Okay, that's dangerous in attention-driven markets. The bet here is that delayed pain elsewhere eventually arrives, and arrives harder. The timing differences matter here, and being right too early can feel like being wrong. Perhaps the biggest risk isn't technical or economic here, it's cultural. ICP is transitioning from a crypto native culture to an infrastructure native one. And not everyone wants that. It's just some participants don't want stability, they want velocity. Those participants will leave, and that exodus can be misinterpreted as failure rather than filtration. Every long-lived system accepts a trade-off, and Mission 70 is no two ways. It's a trade-off. Short-term excitement for long-term survivability, because Mission 70 chooses survivability, not passively, deliberately. The risks are real, but they're the risks of growing up and not falling apart. That distinction matters, because if Mission 70 fails, it won't be because inflation was reduced. It will be because usage didn't justify existence. And no incentive structure can fix that. But if usage continues to grow, then Mission 70, it won't be remembered as a proposal. It will be remembered as the moment ICP crossed the invisible line from experimental network to economic system. Because everything we've explored today isn't just numbers or tokenomics. It's the invisible architecture shaping the future of digital infrastructure. The changes under Mission 70 show how discipline, vision, and careful design can transform a network from high inflation to long-term sustainability while unlocking entirely new ways for people and enterprises to invest and interact with technology. And understanding this isn't about chasing quick wins. It's about seeing how a network, a token, and its ecosystem can evolve together quietly but powerfully. And this is all about bringing mass adoption. Think about the systems you rely on every day and how small shifts in design can ripple into massive, long-term positive impacts. Because this perspective might change the way you see digital finance, decentralized networks, and the very nature of economic growth. Because everything comes together when you see it. So from that angle, so, you got to stay curious and let your journey continue. If this video cut through the noise and actually gave you clarity, not hype, not hopium, then do 3 things right now. Hit the like button so this video reaches people who are being tired of being misled. subscribe, because this channel is about understanding where technology, money, power, and actually going before the headlines catch up. And comment with what clicks for you and what you think about Mission 7. Are you going to be voting yes or no? And I want to hear your thoughts on what you think about the perspective of everything that I've said. And I genuinely believe that cutting the costs is going to lower the risk of failure for the whole network and the system itself. This will drive institutional capital into the ecosystem. It's obviously going to bring about enterprise and mass adoption, but also accelerate government mass adoption too on that angle also. And also on that front also, taking away the waste and the cost and the loss of capital cost also too there, that would eventually create more of a price appreciation over the medium long term also. Because at the end of the day, yes, some people in the long end will lose incentives and they're not going to be happy about that. But then again, this will improve the survivability of the ICP ecosystem over the long run, because the ecosystem is spending a lot of money. A lot of money is going to waste. Yeah, the technology is the best out there. There's nothing that comes close. Like majority of the people that we speak to, why do they invest into ICP? We invest in it because of the technology. The technology is great. It's light years away. It could be argued 10 years, 15, 20 years ahead of any competition. No competition can emulate what they're doing from a technological front. If it keeps hemorrhaging money, then it still could put the ecosystem at risk. You can have the best technology, but if the economics are not aligned, institutional capital sees it as too risky. They're just not going to. They get deterred from investing, and then when this will also limit. This will also limit the supply dumps in the price of ICP also. Institutional adoption will drive capital, cut the waste. This is all about bringing mass adoption because, why? Because then the percentage risk of ICP failing minimizes drastically if Mission 70 gets approved. And because they're launching it at the right time for CAF and AI to go through mass adoption, because they know that we've got the built-out phase, we're in the mature phase. CAF and AI is going to bring the cycle burn rate, considerably very high. And by cutting the costs, what's that going to do? It's going to create a massive imbalance to the demand-supply mechanism in a positive way. So for me, it's the perfect timing for it, and it puts us into the next phase of infrastructure mass adoption from the government side and also from the enterprise side. And everything will all align on that note positively. That's why it's, in my educated financial opinion, for the survivability of the network, to give it a high degree of probability of survivability, and also for the positive effect for the price over the medium long term to perform beyond most people's expectations, I'm voting yes. But for me, more importantly, it's to improve the survivability of the network. Because then again, people can vote no, but people can lock up for 8 years. But if the costs get too high to maintain the ecosystem, what happens then there could be a high degree of probability of failure for the ecosystem, not because the technology is brilliant, but if they're hemorrhaging costs here, it's not sustainable hemorrhaging these costs, then obviously the ecosystem can be put at risk on that part. So I believe that Mission 70 is a need and a must and a want. And for the true believers in the ecosystem that want the best for ICP, regardless of the price, for the true believers like us that know that decentralized compute, it's very important for humanity and for our rights and for what we believe in, and for our safety, to be able to control our data it's integral. It's integral that we have this type of technology that we can control. We're not talking about governments, NGOs that can control it. The survivability of ICP is paramount. It's paramount from my perspective, paramount from the human perspective. So that's why I believe that a Mission 70 yes vote will pretty much me guarantee the survivability over the long term of ICP. It transitions to the next phase of institutional mass adoption. And I just think that will just become natural. That's why they've never spent anything on marketing, because I think that once you take away these risks, the technology that is just light years ahead of anything else will market itself. That's why they never spent anything on marketing. Now with Mission 70, everything makes sense. Once you eliminate that capital risk, this would be the maturity phase of the mass adoption phase coming. It's going to change the whole price structure. Everything will change for the ecosystem to the positive side, because what? It's going to reduce the risk of failure for the ecosystem. And that's what the institutions want, because we invest in believing in the technology. The institutions look at the risk profile of, is this ecosystem going to survive or not survive? And obviously Mission 70 secures its survivability. Do you know where I stand? It's very important, because this is going to shape the next 5, 10, 20 years of this ecosystem. They've got a 20-year roadmap. Mission 70 is going to change, the transition towards that, 20-year roadmap that DFINITY have. And that's where I stand, because for me, I'm looking at over the long term. And for me, it's integrally important that ICP has the highest chance of survivability, because it is built for the quantum future. But obviously you don't want it to hemorrhage costs. You want it to be sound. And Mission 70, it will turn it into an economic fortress, and that's what it needs to give the best probability of survival over the long term. So that's why I'm voting. Anyway, guys, and let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay decentralized, and I'll see you on the internet computer. Until next time.